It is 2:13 in the morning. The room is quiet. Your phone is face down. Nothing is asking anything from you. And then, without warning, your mind produces a sentence you would never choose to say aloud. Maybe it is cruel. Maybe it is frightening. Maybe it is only the name of someone you promised yourself you were finished remembering. The sentence arrives in your own voice. And because it sounds like you assume it must have come from you. Within seconds, the thought becomes evidence. Evidence that you are still broken. Evidence that you secretly want what you fear. Evidence that all the work you have done has changed nothing. But before you put yourself on trial, consider a question that is almost impossible to answer. Did you choose that thought? Not whether you agree with it, not whether you will act on it. Did you choose the exact moment it appeared, the words it used, the memory it opened, or the feeling it carried into the room? If you did not choose its arrival, why should its arrival define you? We say, I think, as though an I stands behind the mind, composing every sentence before consciousness receives it. But watch closely. An experience often seems to happen in reverse. A thought appears. Awareness notices it. Then a narrator says, I thought that. The signature may be added after the letter has already been written. That possibility changes more than philosophy. It changes the way we understand anxiety, creativity, shame, prayer, meditation, responsibility, and the private court in which we are both defendant and judge.
Because perhaps the mind is not a room with one author seated at a desk. Perhaps it is a conversation already underway when awareness enters. Think about the first minute after you woke up today. Before you made a plan, the mind was already moving. A fragment of a dream, a task you forgot, a melody, a face, a complaint, a prediction about the day. You did not open a menu and select those thoughts. They came carrying traces of sleep, memory, hormones, habit, expectation, and whatever waited unfinished from yesterday. The same thing happens in daylight. You are washing a cup and suddenly remember an embarrassing moment from 12 years ago. You are driving and rehearse an argument that has never happened. You are listening to a friend and a judgment flashes through the mind before compassion catches up. Then comes the second thought. What kind of person thinks that? The second thought often hurts more than the first. It confuses an event with an identity. Having a thought is not the same as believing it. Believing it is not the same as intending it. Intending is not the same as acting. And acting once is not always the same as becoming. These are not excuses. They are distinctions, and a moral life becomes impossible without them. An intrusive image is not a confession. A frightened prediction is not a prophecy. A flash of anger is not yet a decision. A compassionate impulse is not yet a compassionate life. The arrival matters. But what happens after arrival matters differently. A thought can use your vocabulary without being issued by your command. Where then does it come from?
The honest answer is not nowhere. Unchosen does not mean uncaused. Every mind carries momentum. A smell can open a memory before you identify the smell. A change in the body can make the world feel dangerous before you know you are tired. A phrase from childhood can become the grammar of an adult fear. A problem abandoned at dinner can reorganise itself while you sleep and return as an idea in the shower. Imagine a river crossing a country at night. By the time it reaches you, it carries rain from mountains you never saw, soil from distant banks, fallen branches, reflected light, and the pressure of weather hundreds of miles away. You stand at one bend and say, "This is my river." That statement is not false. The river is part of your landscape, but you did not place every object in the current. Thought is not literally water, and you are not a passive shore. Still, the metaphor helps. Mental life carries history forward. It responds to conditions. It combines material from different places. Much of its movement has already begun before awareness gives it a name. Researchers studying spontaneous thought begin with a simple fact. When the mind is released from an immediate task, it does not become empty. It remembers. It simulates. It wanders. It invents conversations. It tests futures. It returns to injuries. It discovers connections. Sometimes you know this is happening. Sometimes you wake inside a chain of thought several minutes after it began. Scientists use terms such as mind-wandering and spontaneous thought for parts of this inner movement. Spontaneous does not mean magical, random, or without causes. It means the next mental state may arise with relatively weak deliberate guidance or weak pressure from the immediate environment. But even this requires care, because a thought can feel uncontrolled while being tightly constrained. Rumination is an example. The mind circles the same wound again and again. You are not deliberately choosing each sentence, yet fear, shame, or grief holds the stream inside a narrow channel. Dreaming may be less constrained by the outside world, but memory still supplies its faces. Creativity can feel like surprise, yet years of practice shape what becomes possible. When a musician suddenly hears the missing melody, the idea is new, but it did not come from an empty universe. It arrived through a nervous system trained to recognise what fits. The mind is not divided into only two options, controlled or random. It moves through layers of constraint. Goals pull. Habits pull, the body pulls, the room pulls. Memory offers fragments. Emotion gives some fragments urgency. Language gives them shape. Attention brightens one possibility, while inhibition quiets another. The result may enter awareness as a sentence, no single part authored alone. This is where popular neuroscience often gives us the wrong picture. You may have heard that one network creates the self, or that a particular region is the home of the inner narrator. The brain is not organised so neatly. Networks associated with memory, internally directed thought, attention, salience, control, language, and bodily regulation interact in changing combinations.
The default network often participates when thought turns inward, toward memory, imagination, social meaning, or the story of the self. But it is not a tiny person inside the brain. It does not work alone, and it does not explain every kind of spontaneous thought. There is no known chamber where the final thinker sits. There is coordination. Think of an orchestra before a melody reaches the audience. Breath is already moving through brass. Fingers are already finding strings. Musicians respond to the score, the conductor, one another, and years of training. No single instrument contains the symphony. No miniature orchestra hides inside the orchestra to make the real decisions. The music emerges from organized participation. Thought may be less like a command from a king and more like music arising from a living ensemble. But here is where the question becomes dangerous. If no central thinker writes every thought, does that mean there is no self? And if there is no separate author standing outside the machinery, can anyone be responsible for a life? We often answer too quickly. Brain activity comes before awareness, therefore free will is dead. The self is constructed, therefore the self is fake. Thoughts arise on their own, therefore nothing is anyone's fault. Each conclusion travels farther than the evidence. No central author does not mean no person. A city is real even though no single street is the city. A body is real even though no single cell contains the person. A promise is real even though it cannot be held apart from words, memory, trust, and time. Some realities exist as organized patterns.
The self may be such a pattern, a changing continuity of body, memory, relationship, attention, value, and action. It can be injured, divided, trained, forgotten, and renewed. Its dependence on conditions does not make it imaginary. A melody is a pattern, yet it can bring someone to tears. A storm is a pattern, yet it can move an ocean. Constructed does not mean unreal. Distributed does not mean powerless. The suspicion that thought does not require a permanent thinker is much older than brain imaging. In Buddhist traditions, teachings often translated as no self challenge the idea of an independent, unchanging owner behind physical and mental experience. This is sometimes reduced to a slogan, "There is no self." But slogans are poor containers for difficult truths. Buddhist traditions do not all explain the teaching in exactly the same way, and the point is not that a scanner looked inside the skull and failed to photograph a soul. The inquiry is experiential and ethical. Look closely at sensation. It changes. Look at feeling. It changes. Perception, intention, memory, consciousness, each depends on conditions and each moves. Which one is the permanent ruler? You might answer, the observer behind them. So search for the observer. Perhaps you find an image of your face, but the image is being observed. Perhaps you hear the word me, but the word is another thought. Perhaps you feel a point behind the eyes, but when attention moves into the chest, the feet, or the sounds of the room, that location changes. Perhaps you find the feeling of being the one who is looking. Can that feeling also be noticed? The search becomes an endless mirror. Every candidate for the final watcher appears as one more event within experience. This does not prove that no self, soul, or enduring identity exists. Neuroscience cannot settle that question by itself. It reveals something more modest and more intimate. The self is difficult to find as a separate object because it may not be an object at all. It may be an activity, a point of view, a relationship among changing processes, a way a living being holds continuity through time. The no-self challenge asks whether suffering grows when these changing processes are grasped as permanent possessions. My fear, my failure, my insult, my thought. When the word my hardens, a passing event can become a prison. Yet no self need not erase ordinary people, consequences, love or compassion. In many interpretations, loosening the imagined owner makes compassion more urgent because the boundaries we defend are less absolute than they appear. Western philosophy has its own process views. The self has been described as a bundle, a narrative, an embodied organisation, or a continuing activity rather than an unchanging substance. These accounts disagree about important things, but they share a question. What if the thinker is not something hidden behind thought? What if thinker is one name for the organised process of thinking, remembering, feeling and responding? Now, the deeper problem is not where the thought came from, it is how a thought becomes mine. Researchers studying agency often distinguish between a direct feeling of causing an action and a later judgment that says, I did that. Those experiences can draw on intention, prediction, bodily feedback, context, and what actually happened. Agency may not arrive as one perfect internal certificate. It may be built from signals that usually agree. Thought ownership may work in a similar way. A sentence appears in familiar language. It matches your concerns. It connects to your memories. No external speaker is present. The mind attributes the thought to itself. Usually this is useful. Ownership supports planning, communication, continuity and accountability. But the attribution can become too broad. The fact that a thought belongs to your mental life does not prove that your conscious identity deliberately selected its first appearance. You can be the place where a thought happened without being the author who summoned it. And now we reach the experiments that seem to threaten freedom itself. In simple laboratory tasks, people may be asked to move a finger whenever they feel like it, or choose between two buttons while researchers measure brain activity. Some studies have found information related to the eventual movement before participants report conscious awareness of deciding. The headline writes itself. Your brain decides before you do. But who is the you being separated from the brain? The sentence imagines a passenger trapped inside the skull while the machinery makes secret choices below deck. The experiment is famous. The conclusion is far less certain. First, pressing an arbitrary button is not the same kind of act as deciding whether to forgive someone, end a relationship, tell the truth, or devote 10 years to a calling. Meaningful choices develop through reasons, values, relationships, and consequences. They rarely begin at one isolated millisecond.
Second, participants must report when an intention became conscious. That requires looking backward into a moving experience and assigning a time to something that may have emerged gradually. Third, above chance prediction is not certainty. A pattern can make one outcome more likely without proving that a complete decision was already made. And fourth, the readiness potential itself may not mean what the popular story assumes. One influential account suggests that spontaneous neural fluctuations can accumulate toward a threshold. When researchers average many trials backward from the moment of movement, those fluctuations can appear as a smooth rise. The signal may reflect the dynamics by which an arbitrary movement becomes likely, not a hidden executive signing a finished decision long before awareness. Other work suggests that early preparation does not always make action inevitable. A movement can sometimes still be canceled until a later point of no return. None of this proves a freedom untouched by biology. It does show why a finger movement should not be promoted into a final verdict about love, character, guilt, or the soul. Brain activity before conscious report is exactly what we should expect if consciousness is part of the brain-body process rather than a supervisor standing outside it. The person begins before the narrator announces the beginning. Your values can shape attention before you speak them. Practice can alter which response becomes available under pressure. A promise made years ago can organize action before you rehearse the reason again. Consciousness may arrive late to some processes, while still helping form the life from which future processes arise. Perhaps we have been searching for agency at the wrong scale.
We look for freedom in the instant before a thought appears. We imagine a tiny self creating a choice from nothing, untouched by history, desire, reason, or cause. But a choice with no connection to your character, love, memory, or values would not feel more like yours. It would feel arbitrary. Agency may live across time. It lives in what you practice until it becomes easier to remember. It lives in the environment you enter and the ones you leave. It lives in the voices you repeat, the habits you feed, the sleep you protect, the help you accept, and the stories you learn to question. It lives in the pause that keeps a first impulse from becoming an action. It lives in the apology that changes what happens next. You may not choose the next thought, but you can participate in some of the conditions from which later thoughts will arise. Not all conditions. No one chooses childhood, inheritance, every wound, every cultural pressure, or every loss. Illness, trauma, compulsion, fear, and exhaustion can narrow the space in which reflection is possible. Any serious account of responsibility must make room for these differences. But limited agency is not zero agency. A sailor does not command the wind. The sail still matters. This gives us a more honest relationship with inner life. If every thought is treated as a chosen declaration, shame becomes endless. You prosecute yourself for material you did not deliberately summon. If no thought is treated as relevant, denial becomes endless. You repeatedly feed a pattern, act through it, harm others, and insist that nothing belongs to you because nothing began with an uncaused choice.
The middle position is harder. Do not confuse arrival with endorsement. Do not confuse non-authorship with permission. Imagine that someone you love does not answer a message. Before you decide what the silence means, a thought arrives. They are pulling away.
The thought does not arrive alone. The body tightens. Memory retrieves 3 other silences. Attention begins scanning the relationship for evidence. A neutral delay becomes a pattern, and the pattern becomes a verdict.
You may not have chosen the first sentence, but now several paths become possible. You can send an accusation. You can disappear before they have the chance to leave. You can repeat the thought until uncertainty feels like certainty. Or you can notice that an old alarm has entered a new room. You can wait. You can ask a direct question. You can admit that the silence frightened you without pretending you know why it happened. None of these responses comes from nowhere. The capacity to pause may have been built through therapy, friendship, meditation, painful mistakes, or the memory of what happened the last time fear spoke first. Even the wiser response is conditioned. But conditioned does not mean empty. The person you have practiced becoming is now participating in the next moment, and the outcome feeds the system again. If accusation is repeatedly rewarded with temporary relief, the mind may offer accusation more quickly next time. If honest inquiry creates safety, another response becomes easier to find. The relationship between thought and action is not a single choice floating outside history. It is a loop through which history can sometimes be revised.
This is why responsibility cannot be reduced to blaming someone for the first thing their nervous system produced. Responsibility also concerns what is rehearsed, what is repaired, what help is sought, and what conditions are knowingly maintained. A violent thought can appear without making a person violent. Rehearsing it, celebrating it, organising a world view around it, and acting on it are different events. A compassionate thought can also appear without making a person compassionate. Compassion becomes a life through repetition, sacrifice, and action. The first movement may be unchosen. The relationship to it can still become character. Perhaps freedom begins after the thought appears. Not always, not perfectly. Sometimes the body moves before reflection can open. Sometimes a nervous system trained by danger hears an alarm where another person hears only silence. Sometimes the pause is small enough to be almost invisible. But sometimes awareness creates room. The thought says, "Answer now." Awareness notices urgency. The thought says, "They always leave." Awareness notices an old prediction wearing the face of the present. The thought says, "This feeling will never end." Awareness notices that fear has written a future it cannot know. This noticing is not a ghost floating above the brain. It is part of the living system becoming responsive to its own movement. It can recruit memory, restraint, language, imagination, relationship, and care. Awareness is not proof that the soul is separate from nature, nor is awareness made meaningless by identifying neural activity associated with it. Naming the instrument does not erase the music. Try a small experiment now. Do not force the mind to become silent. Do not search for a mystical state. Simply wait for the next thought you can notice. It may arrive as words. It may be an image. It may begin as tension and become language only when you attend to it. When it comes, ask, "Did I choose the moment of its arrival?" Then ask, what conditions may have helped it appear? This room, this story, hunger, fatigue, a memory, a hope, a worry waiting beneath the task? You may not know. Now ask, do I believe it? Is it useful? Does it require action, investigation, compassion, or simply time? What changes if you do not immediately call it meek? This practice is not a way to dismiss every thought. Some thoughts bring information you have avoided. Some fears recognise genuine danger. Some memories return because something remains unfinished. The goal is not to treat thought as meaningless noise. The goal is to meet thought before ownership becomes obedience. There is mercy in this. You are not required to have manufactured every shadow that crosses the mind, and there is responsibility in it. What crosses the mind can still enter the world through you. Perhaps the thinker is not an inner typist writing every sentence. Perhaps the thinker is the larger activity through which thoughts arise, become known, meet values, and sometimes become action. The mind may be less like a monarchy and more like a parliament. Memory speaks, fear speaks, desire speaks, the body speaks, culture speaks, conscience speaks. People from your past continue speaking through phrases you no longer remember learning. There may be no permanent ruler above the debate. Yet the debate has consequences. Attention does not create every voice, but it can influence which voice becomes policy. Patterns accumulate. Character takes shape. A life becomes recognisable. Responsibility may belong not to a ghost outside causation, but to the whole person learning, failing, repairing and changing within it. This does not solve free will. It gives us a better question. Instead of asking whether a separate self can create thoughts without causes, ask how a human being becomes capable of reflection, restraint, imagination, commitment and transformation. Instead of asking whether the self is an object, ask what kind of continuity deserves the name. Instead of asking who controls every thought, ask what relationship to thought makes a life more truthful. You may never find a thinker standing outside the stream. You may find body, memory, prediction, language, attention, and awareness moving together. You may find an identity assembled again and again from that movement. And still, something remains urgent. The thought is not always chosen. The next act still matters. The first voice is not always yours to command. The voice you strengthen can become part of who you are. So the next time a thought arrives at 2:13 in the morning, pause before turning it into a verdict. Ask what may have brought it here. Ask whether it deserves belief. Ask what will happen if it becomes action. Then notice the quiet possibility between appearance and response. Not a thinker outside the mind learning how to meet itself. And if you're not the author of every thought, what part of your inner life are you willing to take responsibility for?